Good morning. I'm Captain Miller, the old commanding officer of the base way back in the 80s. Came here 1977 to be the executive officer. After 1 year, moved up to the CO's office and stayed 2 more years. The building has been upgraded, and I can tell you it's a whale of a lot better than it was back in those days. And I hope we're able to get some shots in there of what they've done in the office. On the base, I had some 51 tenants, everything ranging from the state of Washington Fisheries Department to, good heavens, the crime, FBI, you name it, and we had it on the base somewhere. I retired in 1980, and the speaker at my retirement ceremony was retired Admiral Russell, lived in Tacoma. Russell's one of the most famous admirals in the Navy. He had been in Alaska for the shoot down of the first Japanese airplane up there, and they had retrieved that airplane, brought it back to North Island, fixed it up, flew it, and we learned how to make our tactics against the Japanese Zero. If we hadn't gotten that airplane, things have come out a good deal different. After I retired from Bowman in 1980, I started working downtown for the Building Owners and Managers Association and stayed there 14 years. I can't believe it, but the man who replaced me, who had been the manager of the Space Needle before that, has now been there for 20 years. I can't believe it. Now I want to tell you a couple of interesting little stories from Sandpoint. These are things that nobody knows but me. One day I realized there was a sailor standing in the outer office. I could see him through the door, demanding to my secretaries to see the commanding officer. And so I listened a little bit, and he said that he liked a Coke every day, and the Coke machine was always out, and he was going to see the commanding officer about this. It's not right. And so I invited him on in, listened to his story, and took out a piece of paper and made a graph on my paper. Down the side of it I put the dates, and across the top, every 2 hours I said, okay, take this paper, and you go back, and every time you find that Coke machine out, or you check it off when you're there, you let me know, and we'll take care of it. Well, you probably already figured out what happened. The Coke machine had been empty one time, and he was outraged. It was never empty again. I never contacted Coke. Everything was cool. And then another day, I looked up from my desk, and here was an old fellow that I had become quite familiar with. His name was Bill. That's not his real name, so we're protecting the innocent here. Bill had been a mechanic during World War II on airplanes down in the hangar that became the Navy Exchange Building. Of course, it's all gone now. But it had been a P-2V outfit, and the P-2V is the airplane you may remember as a truculent turtle. It made the longest flight in the history of aviation. Back in the 40s, actually. He brought in a jar of dark fluid, a pint jar, and it was black, let me tell you. And he said, this is what came out of my transmission, and your shop did it. He wanted me to buy him a new transmission for his old Rambler car. He said, always had it surfaced there at the Navy Exchange garage, and your people put engine oil in my transmission, as you can plainly see. So I took his sample and sent it in for testing to see was it really or was it not. And then he and I went down to the Navy Exchange garage, which of course is now also gone. See the manager. And the manager knew Bill. Oh yes, he remembered Bill. He remembered Bill's car and all that. And he said, we have never changed the transmission fluid in that car. He has never asked to. Well, up above the desk where you stand to do your ordering, here's this huge sign with every possible service that can be on an automobile and the price. And so you stand there and you tell them what you want done on your car, and then they do it. You pay for it, and everybody goes. Said he never had his fluid changed. Well, the order came back, the test, And he said it was transmission fluid, but it was really old and it was absolutely horrible, terrible condition. And so the next question is, well, what did Bill do in the Navy? He was with those P-2 aircraft down there in the hangar. I found out his rating, he was an ADR. And AD is an aircraft mechanic. R stands for reciprocating engines, which is what the P-2V had. Now, what was his primary job on the P-2V? Oil changes. And yet, he had never changed the oil in his transmission on his car. Just another interesting story, ordinary day. I had what I called X Division, where we kept the bad boys. Now, they were not in the brig. They were in a barracks building, and we worked them in the daytime, picking, whatever around the base we could try to keep them busy. It was a separate building all by itself, and it's not very far from where the old gas station was, in that area, right in there where the parking lot is, actually. And they were a constant problem for me, I'll tell you. Those kids didn't want to be here. They didn't want to be in the Navy. They wanted out. They're not treating me right. And so it was on and on and on. Well, one day, a young fellow appeared in front of my desk, a very innocuous-looking young man, nothing particular about him. And he said, I've been keeping my head low down there, and I know things that you probably would like to know. And he says, now, I am a trucker, and I love Kenworth trucks. So I named him Mr. Kenworth at that point. And he said, I've been observing what's going on, and what's going on is over in Building 9, the huge barracks building. He said, up in the attic in there, some of the guys are doing drugs. Really? So, what I did was I went to the Navy Investigative Service. The head man was a friend of mine, and we set up a trap for him up there. And sure enough, we caught our boys up there with their drugs and took care of that problem. And to pay back Mr. Kenworth, I slipped him out of the Navy, and he would call me from his truck every time he passed through Seattle, which would be about once a month. A happy guy, and we solved our problem, so it was a two-way street there. There's a very important street corner just across from the old fire station. As you come in the main gate and you pass the Admiral's building with the flagpole, just beyond that, in the corner there, under the tree, is a monument. It's a monument to honor American prisoners of war and men missing in action. There is a bronze plaque, probably this big, on that concrete post. The tree is an 80-plus-year-old Alaskan fir tree, and it was brought in specifically and put on that corner specifically when that plaque was placed there. It's called the Freedom Tree. It was erected in 1973 to honor our missing men in, as they call it, Indochina. And I took charge of that plaque in honor of two of the people that I have mentioned in my big written story about my time in the Navy. The first one is Private Leslie Simmons. Leslie was the son of the Simmons family down in Kalama. His mother had been a high school friend of my mother, and I'd known them all my life. In fact, today, one of our best friends is his youngest daughter who lives over on Hood's Canal. He had joined the Marines, was at Camp Pendleton in California. They were coming home for Christmas in 1948, and there were about, I think, 4 airplanes in the flight, and this was the lead airplane. And they ran into heavy weather coming up through Washington here, and 3 of the airplanes turned back and landed in Portland, but the lead aircraft pressed on. And a year later, they were found on Mount Rainier, and you may have read about that. So there was a big memorial service held down there some 65 years ago, and all of us went. I still remember the procession of old cars up through the park and up on the hillside where we could look across the valley up on the hillside where the crash had occurred. And the Marines were there with their volleys that they fired, and this was reenacted every year until finally, after many, many years, the service said, "Mrs. Simmons, sorry, we can't do this anymore." But she was the main driving force behind it. The other one was Lieutenant Commander Jim Bowder. He was in my squadron out in Vietnam, and he was my roommate. And we lost him one night on a night bombing mission. The two of us lived in a little bitty room underneath the starboard, that is the right-hand side, bow catapult on the ship. And the catapult is a big steam-driven piston, and when it fires, everybody knows about it. And this thing went right through our room. From our bunks, you could reach out and pat the side of the catapult. Sleep, the ship was operating, 24 hours a day, combat, and the young men up on the flight deck with their equipment, they dropped their hammers on the deck, they dropped chains, and there's no way you could get a good night's sleep. And then you go out at night, no moon, black night, overcast, bombing under flares in the jungle, and we lost him. I've kept track of his family and his little daughter, who was about 4 at the time. Now she's coming up 50 years old, family of her own. Need to go back and add a little bit here to the one Private Leslie Simmons, the monument on the base. His plane was discovered a year after it crashed up there. And in that ensuing time, many people had gone up and looked for it, had not found it. The other one, Jim Bowder, could not find his plane. And today, it has not been confirmed that they've got it. But under the water off the coast, they have found a crash, and they can see some of the numbers on it, and they're pretty sure that that was his plane. And the tragedy of it was that he had come out of day fighters, not night fighters. I was a night fighter from day one, and there's a big difference. And as a senior officer doing his first night work air to ground, it's exceptionally dangerous, and he paid the price for that. Drugs were a constant problem to us. And there was a drug counselor available up in the medical building. And out of my office, if you look over there at the medical building, which is now an office building, the extreme top corner this way was the office of that counselor. It was a young woman who was a sailor in the Navy. And her job, of course, was counseling against the use of drugs. So this young man came in one day and told me about his drug problem, and so I took him over. I walked him over to the office and introduced him to this young lady that he and she were to take care of his drug problem, right? Well, the answer to this story is not a good one. The two of them went AWOL. They both disappeared off the scope and were never seen again. I have no idea where they went, whatever happened to them, but they were gone. One day I looked up from my chair, as it seems I'm always doing, and here stands my friend, Admiral George Flyflett. George was a friend from church, one of the first people I'd met when I came to Seattle. George was a World War II destroyer man, and he was a reserve admiral. He was not on active duty. So he said he had showed his ID card when he came into the gate, as always you do, and the guard realized that his card had expired, and he took it, confiscated the admiral's card. And the admiral was outraged. So what do you do when you're outraged? You go to see the CO, right? So the guard said, well, we do this all the time. When I called him up to find out what's going on, he says, there's nothing unusual about this, nothing against the admiral. He said the card was expired. All he's got to do is go get a new card. So I just smiled. The guard got bragging rights that he had taken the admiral's card, and I got to placate a senior officer, and everybody was happy. So I was grins all around. And here is the picture. Can you see this okay? Mm-hmm. This is out on Lake Washington, and this is Miss Budweiser in the air in the midst of a crash. I was aboard Old Man 4, which is the call sign for the Admiral's barge. The Admiral's barge is simply his yacht. The Navy assigns to him. And this was during the time Bernie Little, Miss Budweiser, was going for the world speed record in the hydroplanes. And it was out from the base and on the north end. And they'd set up all their equipment. And so I took a couple hours off, and we all went down and got into the Navy's motor launch, and we're out there watching, and this thing comes thundering up from the south, just as fast and as hard as it could go. This was a run for the world speed record, and right in front of us, as the picture shows, it lifted up into the air and slammed back down, upside down, and you talk about, I named this story Sudden Silence, because that's what it was, echoing off the hills up on both sides of the lake up there, and we were in the middle of it. And then immediately everybody woke up to what do we do, and we rushed out to rescue Dean Chenoweth. You'll remember him as the famous race car driver, and he flipped another time. Every year the hydroplane races were held down below the bridges, and we would go. And reminds me, remember the Fonz on TV? Fonzie? I got to meet him down there. He was aboard one of the boats when I used to go into the pits and watch what they were doing. Our high school down in the little town of Kalama overlooked the Columbia River. And from the study hall, where we were supposed to be nosing our books and we weren't, we could see blimp cruising up the Columbia River, cruising down the Columbia River, all the ships coming from the shipyard, coming and going. Really an active place. It was a wonderful place to be. Now, Amber 1 was the flyway from north-south, from Seattle to Portland. All the flyways were with colors in those early days. And this place was absolutely a spotter's dream. The blimps were based at Astoria, Oregon, and the blimp hangar is still there. I'm pretty sure one has burned down. But huge, huge buildings. And I'm pretty sure it's a museum. I have been to it, but it's been 20 years ago now. But the blimps were extremely successful anti-submarine ships. They escorted the convoys, and the word is that no convoy was sunk with a blimp there because they had the firepower and they could see and they could hang overhead and look and look and look. They were a great airplane. The blimp came to Seattle during the races that particular year. It had to be about 1979. It could even have been 80, I guess. And they asked if they could moor their blimp on the base. So, sure, you bet. And so their crew was there, and their tie-downs and all that sort of thing. And they said they would give me any spare seats, that I could divvy out spare seats. You see, they were here for their customers. It was the Goodyear Tire Company, and anybody that bought a Goodyear tire, you could go for a blimp ride. Well, sure enough, I had some spare seats. And the Admiral, who at that time was double-hatted, he was, Admiral Duff Arnold was at Whidbey Island, and he also had to cover Seattle because we were temporarily without an admiral. So he brought his full family and absorbed all of my spare blimp ride seats on this particular time. Now that was okay because Duff Arnold had been the commanding officer of VA-22, the Fighting Redcocks, out in Vietnam when I had been out there. So I knew him pretty well. Well, anyway, I did finally get some spare seats, and my wife and my daughter went for the blimp ride, and that was great. We cruised up the lake and looked down on our house over there at the point at Juanita. We were living in the house at the time. And I found that a blimp is a very interesting airbird. It goes 35 miles an hour. Okay, how fast do you think it goes in a dive? 35 miles an hour. How fast does it go up? 35 miles an hour. Because it doesn't weigh anything. See? And all the engines are doing is moving it. And the engines don't care whether it's this way or that way. The lift equals the weight. And the engines just drag it around. And that's the end of my stories. Memories from Building 30. First time I came to Seattle, I came by myself. I left my wife and daughter down in the south part of the state with her parents, and it came up in the late afternoon, and nobody knew who I was, of course, and so I got a good look, and I looked at the entrance to the building. I said, oh, this is not all that great. And I went in, looked around, and it's old, decrepit, and the rest of the base is the same way, and oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? Now, where can I go get some food? Think about it. There isn't any place around Sandpoint. So I had to go all the way up to Lake City to get myself some dinner that night. So that was a bit of a surprise, to tell you, because I had been to Sandpoint in 1948 as part of a basketball team. We played at the University of Washington, the state tournament, and we were berthed in Building 9. And I remember that absolutely like it was yesterday. The interior of that building, the mattresses, the old bunk beds in there. But what I really remember is I went outside the building in evening one day, looked across the street, and here is the theater. And those double doors in the theater were open, and you could see all the way into the screen. And so I walked across the street and stood in the back, just outside the door there, to see what the movie was. And it was A Bell for Adano. And the gist of it was, Adano is a little Italian town way up in Italian Alps, and the Nazis had stolen the town bell. And so the army was going to get the bell back for Adano. And so it was goats and a little kid, Interesting movie. Was one of only two in the entire Navy. The other one was in the office of the man back at Anacostia Air Base in Washington, D.C., who was in charge of all the support activities like Sandpoint. It was a nice fireplace, but I never had a fire in it. I bought myself a chainsaw with an idea I was going to cut some wood, and I cut down an old dead tree out on the golf course on the base, and cut up the wood and so forth, but never got around to bringing wood in for that fireplace because we never used the place for that. The only time we used those, there are two couches that sat right in front of the fireplace, couch, was for entertaining some important guest that might come in. You just sat down and talked to him for a few minutes. So no. We had our weekly department head meetings there. And we had a long table. If you go into that room from the main office now, it was on the right and it ran this direction, and I sat at the far end so I could see who was coming and going out the door. And the overflow from around the table sat on the benches around the outside edge. And that's where we had our weekly department head meetings, where we discussed problems and what's coming up and reports from everybody and so forth. Talk about the buildings on the base. Let's start at this extreme end where housing is now. There were two houses belonging to the Navy. The one across the main street that goes down to the boat ramps now, on this side that's not there anymore, was where I first lived. It was the exec's house. And then the next house to that was the legal officer's house. And then onto the base itself, the first big house inside the chain link fence, that was the commanding officer's house where I lived for 2 years. And it was a very nice house. very, very spacious. Had a garage that went down inside. It even had call it a servant's quarters, which of course never got used while we were there. And then the next house to that was the house for the superintendent of shipbuilding. Phil Passantino and family lived there. And then the third house was the senior legal officer. And he retired and moved to Whidbey Island. And then moving on down over the hill, just inside the gate on the right was the gas station garage where they did all kinds of car work. And then beyond that, toward the water, was the old seaplane, patrol plane hangar. Not seaplane, patrol plane hangar. And they turned that into a huge Navy Exchange building and commissary. Big old barn of a place, but that was the commissary. And the bank and the package store, and then coming back up on the hill again from the housing area on the left was the bachelor officers' quarters. Huge building. In the old days, before it burned out, in the middle was a huge room we called the lake room with windows all around, held for dinners, parties, all kinds of gatherings. And then in the back was the dining room, and on the side in the back was a little room that I gave to the Navy League. We put a sign up over the door, which they loved. Incidentally, that BOQ burned down because a Marine fell asleep on the couch up on the third floor, which was a little kind of a cupola up in there, and the place burned down, and unfortunately I got to see it from my new house across the lake one morning, watched it burn. And then coming on up the street towards the main base, on your right is a white building that was known as the Waves Barracks back in World War II, and it was just an overflow barracks for us. But just over the hill and back a little bit, we had a bowling alley, which has been long gone. Now that whole area is taken up with housing. And back to the main street again, on the right-hand side was the swimming pool, the station theater, the library, and all of that. I had a man drown in the swimming pool one day, and it wasn't even open. He shouldn't have been in there. And I thought I was in big trouble, but I wasn't. It all passed. And on the left was Building 9, that huge, huge building, and on the near end was the chapel. Sunday services there. I had a bit of trouble with that too. I remember one time a young man was caught putting flyers on car windows during a Catholic service down there. And of course I hauled him up, "What are you doing? You're interfering with all that." And he says, "But they're wrong." It's not up to you, young man, you can't do that. You know, things like that are going on all the time. So that, and then the courtroom was on the main gate end of that long Building 9. So there was something important on both ends, and in the middle was the mess hall, which got the NAY award back during the time I was there for being the best food service in the Navy for shore establishment. And then across the street from that, the big brick building was the, we call it dispensary, medical building. That's where I got my gold tooth, up on the top floor. And that's where the sailor ran away with the young woman and so forth. And then of course the Admiral's building, Com 13, right in the middle of it. And I had some of the activity in there. On the part that extends toward Building 30 was ship handling. We had to meet all the ship traffic having to do with the Navy in Puget Sound, and those guys worked for me. So they were in that building. And then, of course, the fire station is there, and it's falling down now. We had a full crew of firemen, and it had a brass pole that you jump on in the upper floor and go sliding down all the way. And next door to it was the armory. We kept and had a petty officer in charge of the weapons that were kept in there for some reason. I don't know what they were there for. And then across the street from me was the big supply building, and a huge building. I was only in there one time. It's a massive place, still is. And then on my side of the street, going toward the water, the next two huge hangars there, I gave those to NOAA. And of course, they're behind the woven wire fence now. And the funny story there is that I couldn't get them to turn the lights off, and they were still on my power bill. I didn't have that kind of money to throw away. So I finally nagged them into taking care of their lights. And then the other hangar, the huge hangar on this other side down there, I don't know that we used it for anything except miscellaneous. For example, one day a float builder came in to see me, and he needed a place to build floats for the parades in Seattle. And so I let him build floats in there. Got me in trouble with the Admiral, but that was blew over. And therefore my daughter got to ride in the float in the parade in Lake City.
That was for Seafair?
Seafair, yeah. And then the, let's see, that's the big...
What about the gas station?
Pardon?
The gas station?
Oh, but he said that was an armory.
Okay.
I think you were, what we call the gas station. Did you use it, was it used for an armory then? So they stored weapons in it?
No, the armory was right beside the fire station, in a little shed there, you might say.
Oh, okay.
That's that shed.
Yeah.
No, and the gas station was not a gas station when I was here. The gas station was part of the Navy Exchange down there by the back gate. But anyway, back to the other end of the base, the long building up against the hill was Public Works. And at the extreme north end of it now is the little sailboat operation where they've got many highly used out on the lake. And then the other hangar, which, what is it called now?
Arena Sports? Hangar 27?
Yeah, the sports hangar there, that's a beautiful operation now. That was a seaplane hangar. And those ramps there were where they would pull up the flying boats. They attached portable wheels onto them and then tow them up onto the ramps there so they could work on them. And this was the primary overhaul point for the PBY Catalinas for the West Coast Navy. And at one time, I think I read that there was as many as 36 of those Catalinas that were here, which is a lot. The golf course was nothing but green grass. There was absolutely no golf, there were no holes, there were no poles, there was nothing to do with the golf course. Now the only activity there behind the BOQ was a rose garden, and that belonged to Captain Bryant. That was his thing, and it was kept. But no, the only thing we did with that golf course, as you will, was to mow it. But, and then I cut down a tree for firewood in the quarters there, but that's about it. This book, Drunk Tank Pink, is kind of interesting so far as we're concerned. We had a brig, as I mentioned to you, down on the port. And the Bosun Baker, who was in charge of the brig for me, a warrant officer, a wiry little man, straight as an arrow, he and I went to a seminar one time down in Tacoma. And the young man that gave the seminar was talking about trying to control prisoners or rehabilitate prisoners and so forth. And he talked about two things that we really caught on to. One was sugar, which activates you and gets you into mischief. Number two was the power of the color pink to soothe. And he wanted to paint a holding cell pink. The state wouldn't let him. So we looked at each other and we said, well, we can do that. So we came back and we instituted those two things. Now on the sugar end of it, the only thing I really remember was one of my chief petty officers came to me one day, tears in his eyes. You know, he says, "You've given me my son back," taking away the sugar. straightened the kid out. And the other one was the color pink. We painted our holding cell pink, and so this spread around. Prisoners around the United States came to see us because the power of pink apparently soothes, takes away the strength, the anger, and all that sort of thing, and we used it for the whole time. And this book is by a psychologist back on, a university professor back on the East Coast, and both Boson and I are mentioned in here. Very interesting. And then I wanted to do one more little thing here. This is a nut from the mechanism of the forward mount bolt in the F-3H Demon, which may be the most dangerous airplane the Navy ever built. In my squadron of 12 airplanes, we lost 11 of them. Now, not all of them were due to the engine, but many of them were. And what happened, why I carried this, is one day out on the ship, and I was always on the flight deck as a maintenance type for launches, and the pilot named Don Swank, airplane, and it was late afternoon. The airplane had just come aboard had been left behind on the beach to have a new engine installed, and my roommate flew it out. Don Swank got in it to fly that night, and when they launched him, fire erupted out of both intake ducts and out of the tail end of the airplane, and I knew right away that it was big trouble. I started running for the bow. I got to the bow, and there he was, and the captain turned the ship a little bit, and he went down the starboard side, standing up in the cockpit, waving to us as the ship went by. Well, you talk about a blow-up, and guess who the power plants officer in the squadron was? You're looking at him. I was in deep trouble. There's no doubt about it. And I remember just a little bit of the story. Got back to the beach from that little carrier qualification deployment. I said, okay, who installed that engine? Because we left a crew behind. Well, it was so-and-so, and he got out of the Navy. He was left behind because he's getting out. Where did he go? Well, he was living with his in-laws up at Escondido. So I drove to Escondido quick like a bunny. And there, the whole family, and he's got kids, and I'm in the front room in my uniform, and I've got the fatal question. You installed the engine into 203 or whatever the number was? No, he said we didn't. He said we just hung it on the rail for the guys to put it in next day. Okay, so it wasn't him. So then I'm back on my research to find out, and a young man named Hinkle. Why do I remember these names for 50 years? Hinkle, oh yeah, he says, I used that to teach the guys how you put it together properly and so forth. Turns out they couldn't get these. It's an elastic stop nut. You use them one time. And the elastic, of course, is to prevent it from backing off. And they had reused a nut. Why? Well, Mr. Miller, we can't get those. That's the story of the Navy. You're required to do it, but then you can't get it. And so they didn't do it. And so that airplane went in with a used forward mount nut in it. So my punishment was every single Saturday, the back had to come off every airplane. And there was multiple screws. They're called the turtle back. And I had to get in there with a flashlight and inspect the forward mount bolt assembly. The whole thing was called a rat trap because it kind of went over center and then the thing came down, and all this bolt did was hold the latch down. It didn't have any. So anyway, boy, did I ever learn my lesson. So I was exceptionally careful from then on. I checked, double checked, triple checked, quadruple checked, everything. So nothing ever happened to me like that, because anything wrong, I found it beforehand. But anyway, I keep this in my pocket as a memento.